So good morning, everybody. My name is Tracy Glenn, and I'm the professor for the Environmental Praxis course. And yeah, welcome to the Environmental Praxis lecture series. This is the last one for this semester. I do want to begin by acknowledging that we're on the unceded, unsurrendered, stolen territories of the Wolastoqey, Passamaquoddy, and the Mi'kmaq. And this series seeks to discuss colonial legacies and decolonial practices and yeah, open dialogue on how to best go about honoring the peace and friendship treaties that were signed between the British Crown and the Indigenous peoples of the Wabanaki starting in the 1700s. So today we have our last speaker in our series, Suzanne Fournier. And Suzanne is the executive director of the National Farmers Union in New Brunswick. She's been in this role for 5 years now. So I think many of you know the NFU. So that the NFU, if you don't, the NFU promotes policies that aim to revitalize agriculture in New Brunswick at the local, national, international levels, advocating for alternative structures and government policies that resist corporate control of food. Suzanne studied political science at Carleton University in Ottawa and has been, like I said, working for the NFU for 5 years now. She is chronically ill and lives in Western New Brunswick with her 2 dogs. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Suzanne.
Thanks, Tracy. Thanks, everyone, for having me here today. I'm the executive director of the National Farmers Union in New Brunswick. I'm so pleased to be here with you. I am going to start with a disclaimer that I am not an expert in mining or nutrient management, but I am going to be talking about both of these topics a little bit. So who is the National Farmers Union? This is a picture of our NFU New Brunswick president, Eva Rehak, cleaning loofah, which are gourds. The National Farmers Union is Canada's national farm organization committed to small scale and family farms. Promoting agroecology and food sovereignty for over 50 years, the NFU does not waver in our vision for farmers, eaters, and the earth, embedded in social justice and economic justice in Canada and internationally. The NFU is a direct membership organization made up of Canadian farms who share common goals. Members of the union believe that through an organization that represents all commodities in Canada, it is possible to promote the small-scale farm as the most appropriate and efficient means of agricultural production. Our goal is to work together to achieve agricultural policies which will ensure dignity and security of income for farmers while enhancing the land for future generations. In addition to farms, our membership includes youth members, farm worker members, and associate members. They are all valued parts of the NFU family. Farm youth is any youth working on a farm without a farm family or farm unit membership. Farm workers are individuals who work on a farm but don't own or operate it. And associate members are non-farmers who understand that food issues are everyone's concern and who want to help farmers build a sustainable and nutritious food system in Canada. New Brunswick is the district of the NFU, and we maintain our own board and staff. The NFU-NB is one of 2 accredited farm organizations in the province. And as Tracy mentioned, we promote policies that aim to revitalize agriculture in New Brunswick by strengthening small-scale farms. So in order to understand why potash is mined for agricultural production, we need to look at the history of industrial agriculture. Humans have grown food and cultivated crops for over 10,000 years, but only in the last 100 years have we relied on chemicals to grow our food. And in the last 150, we've seen changes in our climate. This is not a coincidence. The industrial model of agriculture was created to encourage economic growth without regard for environmental stewardship or sustainability. This model, empowered by agribusiness, was forced onto farmers to specialize instead of diversify, to increase scale every year, and to export goods. Industrial agriculture requires the use of inputs like chemicals and factory-made fertilizers, hybrid seeds, more and larger equipment, and constant investment or loans. The patenting and hybridization of seed is another byproduct of the industrial model and something the NFU is working a lot on right now. In crops without unpatented or open pollinated options, companies have been able to raise the price of seed and to link seed sales to the sale of other inputs, such as pesticides, herbicides, and fertilizers, which they sell as packages. This encourages the farmer to use and become reliant on all of these products. So a little bit more about industrial agricultural changes. The last slide was CO2. You can see a dramatic increase there in the 1800s during the Industrial Revolution. This is methane, same thing, and nitrogen. So across all of these, there's pretty regular fluctuations and then dramatic rises starting in the 1800s. So industrial agriculture affects farm income. This graph compares the gross farm revenue and realized net income in millions of dollars. The figures have been adjusted for inflation and government subsidies have been removed. In the last 50 years, the gap between gross revenue and realized net income has grown at an alarming rate. The green indicates years of positive net income, and the red are years of negative net income. The blue area indicates the difference between what farmers take home when they sell their products, what they earn, and the money, and what they have left when they pay their bills. So the blue area represents the farmers' costs, the money they give to machinery companies, fertilizer companies, fuel companies, chemical companies, banks. Notice how that area has increased over time. Key to the NFU analysis is that farmers have been pushed and pressured to be far too reliant on purchased inputs. And as they've become reliant on these purchased inputs, more of the wealth that they create is siphoned off into what's indicated in that blue area. In New Brunswick, from the end of the Depression to the mid-80s, farmers were keeping almost half of every dollar they produced. From the mid-80s until now, the farmer's share after they pay their bills is approximately 7%. Declining farm income levels and increasing debt burdens have accelerated the exodus of farming families, particularly rural youth, off the land. Services in rural centers have likewise declined as a result, further eroding the viability of communities. We have called on the government to refocus agricultural policies so that increasing farm income is the primary objective. This in turn will stimulate economic growth in rural areas and encourage an increase in contributing to the number of farms, the economy, and the community. So let's look at farmland in New Brunswick. According to the New Brunswick Census of Agriculture 2016, from 2011 to 2016, the number of farms in New Brunswick declined at a rate of 14%, the second largest percentage decline in Canada. For comparison, the percentage of farms nationally declined at 6% in the same period. More than 80% of the provincial decline was seen in small-scale farms. There is a new 2021 agricultural census. That data is not shown on these graphs, but it shows an 18% decline from 2016 of both the total number of farms and the total area of farmland. During the last 40 years, the number of farms reported in New Brunswick has halved, and yet the average farm size keeps growing. So we have fewer farms, but larger farms. This has contributed to a reliance that the province has on imported food. And it also means that farmland is becoming concentrated into the ownership of a few people or corporations rather than many small operations and owners. More than half of Canada's best agricultural land and 1/3 of our second best land is within a 50-mile radius of the country's largest cities. Because it lies within direct commuting distance of the major centers, there is a great deal of pressure to use this land for residences, recreation, and speculative holdings. Urban and industrial sprawl encroaches yearly on highly productive farmland. And this in turn causes further environmental impact when farmers are forced to clear forested areas or convert wetland into farmland because open agricultural land is no longer available or protected as such. The NFU believes that in most cases, the development of this land for non-agricultural purposes was unnecessary, and with proper study and consideration of soil types and best use of land around urban centers, the same development could have occurred in the same general vicinity without destroying agricultural land. As population increases, land is fast becoming scarce. And as land value rises, it becomes more difficult for new and young farmers to enter farming. We believe that agricultural land should be owned by farmers or farm workers themselves to ensure that the agricultural resources remain in control of agricultural producers. This is to prevent rural depopulation, which results from large corporate farms, and to discourage large landholding by banks, non-resident investors, and non-farming corporations. The NFU believes that the maintenance of strong rural community in Canada is an essential part of our national culture, and that farmers must continue to hold a distinct place in the national identity as the basic producers of food. The loss of small-scale farms severely changes and impoverishes rural communities, the landscape, biodiversity, the environment, the culture of food, and will dangerously affect food security and food safety. The impact of community, especially farming community, on the mental health of farmers cannot be understated. We view land as a natural resource, not a commodity to be exploited. So let's talk about mining. Canada is a global player in the mining sector and a leading producer of commodities such as potash, iron ore, coal, uranium, nickel, copper, gold, and diamonds. Canada's share of mining worldwide is substantial. According to its Natural Resources Ministry, nearly half of the world's mining companies are headquartered in Canada. The NFU has a long-standing commitment to act in solidarity with Indigenous peoples. We support initiatives by Indigenous peoples to resist resource extraction and energy projects that disrupt Indigenous food and governance systems and interfere with the health of their lands, territories, and communities. We have met with representatives of Mi'kmaq Waldobludahan Inc. to discuss the Potash RFP and other resource extraction, and will continue to work with them on these topics. In 2021, it came to the attention of the NFU-NB that an amendment to the Mining Act would change permission requirements for prospectors. If it had passed, permission would only then have been required if prospectors intended to use heavy equipment. Now, a prospector simply driving in fields, let alone tampering with soil and plants, can do significant damage to crops and the livelihoods of farmers. Mining companies have often claimed that they have little interest in mineral claims on cultivated land due to fertilizer and pesticide use. But New Brunswick farmers have indicated that this is not true and regularly have stakes or prospectors on their land, particularly in Charlotte County. With our formal collaboration under Agriculture NB, we wrote an open letter, which is what you see here, signed by 45 allied organizations, which was sent to Premier Higgs and all MLAs and was read in the Legislative Assembly. The bill did not pass the third vote, but was sent to the Law Amendments Committee, where it was recommended that Bill 75 not proceed in its current form. This was a significant win for us and our allied organizations, but it does not prevent Bill 75 from coming back or another bill being introduced to make similar changes to the Mining Act. All right, so what you're seeing on the left is a piece of potash. Potash is primarily mined and used in fertilizer for its potassium content. Fertilizer is most commonly sold in NPK blends, which is what you see on the right, nitrogen, phosphate, and potash. Those are the three different numbers. Fertilizer is used in agriculture to improve soil conditions for growing crops more quickly and with higher yields. Fertilizer with potassium from potash is used on most crops, including rice, corn, and even in palm oil production. Potash can also be used to make glass, ceramics, soaps, detergents, water softeners, and food products. Potash is second only to gold in export value. So what does potassium do? Potassium regulates the stomata, which are the small pores on the leaves that allow gases to move in and out of plant cells. It maintains turgor, which is water pressure in the plant that keeps it upright, and osmotic equilibrium, which is the transfer of nutrients in the plant from areas of high to low density. Potassium is particularly crucial in fruit growth. Potassium levels do not change significantly from year to year in response to climatic conditions or crop management practices. Where required, applied potash can increase crop yield and quality, but depending on the crop type, it may also increase frost and disease resistance, palatability, storage quality, and other characteristics. One thing to note, excessive applications of potash can lead to high levels of potassium in grass crops, since grass will take up more potassium than is required for their growth, which we call luxury consumption. And subsequently, a high potassium content in grass can lead to high potassium in dairy rations. So high potassium levels in dairy rations reduce the utilization of calcium and magnesium by lactating cows and may lead to related herd health problems. The production of urine is increased. This requires more energy and places additional stress on the kidneys of cows, and they become more prone to milk fever. This is a graph of New Brunswick agricultural emissions. You won't see potash on here because it is not a significant contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. I will note for this lecture that nitrogen is produced at and used at a far higher rate in agricultural fertilizer than potassium, and it has a significant impact on greenhouse gas emissions. It's the blue that you see at the bottom. Fertilizers boosted our ability to feed the planet, but they're also creating vast and growing dead zones in our lakes and seas. Agricultural runoff is simply water that is transported over the Earth's surface. There may be surface runoff of pesticides, fertilizers, and manure, or leaching of nitrogen into groundwater. This means that dissolved contaminants will eventually find their way into lakes, rivers, or oceans. Much of the phosphorus that is moved from agricultural lands is bound to soil particles. And though it may not be a problem in that form, once deposited in fresh water, there may be a slow release of phosphorus in a dissolved form that can be readily taken up by aquatic plants, like algae. In a toxic algae bloom, tiny photosynthetic organisms reproduce explosively, then throw off chemicals, which in addition to nausea can cause brain and liver damage. And when the algae die, their decomposition sucks oxygen out of the water, which creates aquatic dead zones where almost nothing can survive. There is a global push to expand fertilizer production, all three NPK, partly as a result of the actions of Russia. Saskatchewan is a global epicenter for potash mining and is already working to ramp up production. In New Brunswick, farmers are likely to see little benefit if a new mine were to go forward. 95% of the potash extracted from the former New Brunswick mine was exported abroad and not used locally. Now, the NFU does not advocate for banning fertilizer completely, but as I mentioned before, its use is closely tied to both the farm income crisis and the climate crisis. We have to find ways to use it better, more efficiently and effectively from better sources and without corporate influence or greed. For over a year, so before the conflict in Ukraine, the NFU has requested the House of Commons Agriculture Committee to investigate, to undertake a thorough review of fertilizer pricing, the structure of the sector, and the conduct of its largest corporations. Fertilizer companies charging exorbitant prices claims supply chain issues, yet these same companies are making windfall profits. Canadian farmers are trying to cope with huge levels of farm debt while interest rates start to go up, and yet fertilizer companies are able to profiteer because there is next to no competition within this supply chain. It's very easy for companies to rename their profiteering as inflation, but it is precisely this kind of profiteering that fuels inflation. So the Potash RFP, this is what an RFP looks like from the government of New Brunswick. In October 2022, GNB issued a request for proposals, RFP, for potash exploration in the Salt Springs and Castile Lake areas, southeast of Norton. The area in question is about 26,350 hectares in size, and most of the land is privately owned. This request for proposals is for exploration only, and this release stated, quote, "If no satisfactory proposals are received, exploration rights will not be issued," unquote. But we know that proposals have been received after Brunswick News asked the government for comment on the status of the RFP. The Mining Act really protects mining companies and not New Brunswickers. So here are some examples of mining regulations and requirements for this potash RFP. Any exploration work that interferes with the use and enjoyment of the land or requires the use of equipment beyond very basic hand tools and or some geophysical equipment is considered work of a damaging nature. Any work of a damaging nature must not proceed until landowner permission has been obtained and appropriate permissions are obtained from the department. If potash is discovered under your property, it does not guarantee a mine site will be proposed on your land. There are several legislative steps in this process, including, for example, an environment impact assessment, consultation with First Nations and community, reclamation plan and securities, landowner agreements, feasibility studies, and various approvals and permitting for aspects of construction and operation. Obtaining land access permission or rights for the development of a mine site is between the proponent, so the prospector or mining company, and the landowner. Mineral resources are vested in the Crown and are therefore public resources for all New Brunswickers. This is one of the former potash mines in the Sussex area. I think this is the Penobscot one. So let's talk a little bit about labor with mining. Because agriculture, fishing, and forestry are now employing fewer people than they used to, it means that many provinces are looking for engines of economic growth, like mining. However, potash mining is not a significant creator of jobs. Once a new mine is built, the actual mining operation does not require many people to be employed. It's a very mechanized process. Mining companies in Canada do not appear to hire migrant workers in their operations. However, Canadian mining companies have significant impacts abroad, including regularly displacing people. So the effects of potash mining. At Castile Lake, potash and salt were discovered in 1973, and a mine was subsequently opened. In 1996, an unmanageable water inflow penetrated the underground workings and eventually forced permanent closure of the mining operations. There was also mining operations for potash at Penobscot and Millstream, and Millstream had the same serious underground flooding issues. In 2018, Nutrien officially closed the Penobscot mine, which had been in care and maintenance since 2016 and not producing any potash. So farmers are already concerned about New Brunswick's water tables and water management strategies, especially with the drought in 2020 and other climate impacts. Potash extraction uses and damages this precious resource. The former potash mine extracted an average of 11 million liters of water from the Penobscot aquifer every day. An aquifer vulnerability assessment conducted by the Royal District Planning Commission in 2012 reported that groundwater from Grand Lake to the Bay of Fundy is vulnerable to contamination. 60 homes in the Penobscot area reported losing their water supply after the mining activities began. These were replaced first with inadequate tanks, which did not provide any water to livestock or pets, only humans. And then central water systems paid for in large part by the province of New Brunswick and by the homeowners who had to pay a fee for the service. Penobscot residents and farmers also dealt with displacement of buildings and land. Productive fields became too wet to farm, and they expressed concerns over the proper treatment of the mining wastewater. Furthermore, properties devalued, sinkholes appeared, and questions raised about human health concerns were never addressed. Now, it is important to note in this context for Penobscot that both potash mining and shale gas fracking were occurring at the same time, and the cumulative effects of both operations were never studied or understood. If a new potash mine were to go forward, there is also shale gas fracking happening in that area right now, and we would see the exact same issues, likely. So Potash Corp, which is now Nutrien, the world's largest fertilizer company, portrays itself as deeply committed to sustainability and has long lists of awards and citations on its website, along with many pages reporting on social and environmental indicators. They have reported, quote, "In communities where Potash Corp operates, we do not believe we have a negative societal impact," unquote. The company's New Brunswick operations were even cited as a good example of community integration by the International Development Research Council, IDRC, in 2001. New Brunswick citizens have fought to have the corporation take responsibility and compensate them for significant damages that have occurred to their properties, which they allege are the direct result of the company's operations. Citizens also note that many families have left the area and are moving away because of problems like displacement and losses in property value. So in the first lecture, Sarah talked about the effects of mining in Borneo, and mining has devastating effects to people and the environment in many countries, where often they generally have less stringent human rights or environmental protection laws. You could have a whole lecture series on that, so I'm not going to go into mining abuses abroad. So alternatives to potash, what are our options? When humans invented agriculture some 10,000 years ago, they were almost immediately confronted with the conundrum. Crops need nutrients to grow, but harvesting them removes the nutrients, leaving the soil unfit for future harvests. Now, early farmers got around this by letting some fields lie fallow, spreading animal waste on the land, planting legumes, which possess restorative properties. These are still important best management practices that we advocate and work on today, which are crop rotations, complex crop rotations, and crop rotations using legumes. Manure is an excellent source of NPK, micronutrients, and organic matter. The use of livestock manure reduces the requirement for chemical fertilizers. Nutrient management planning estimates nutrients available in manure by considering the farm, specific management practices, and reduces the chemical fertilizer requirement accordingly. Human pea cycling can also cut down on the amount of conventional fertilizer that farmers purchase. Our urine contains not only phosphorus, but also large amounts of nitrogen and potassium. And at the same time, it keeps these nutrients out of the sewage system and by extension, the waterways. Kelp, which is on the left, can also be used as a potassium-rich fertilizer that is a renewable resource if you are in an area that it's readily available. We also advocate for 4R best management practices for fertilizer use, which is the right product or formulation in the right amount at the right time in the right place. And that means usually placed with seed. This uses fertilizer more efficiently and effectively. So at the beginning, I mentioned that the NFU believes and advocates for agroecology. Agroecology is a holistic approach to food production that uses and creates social, cultural, economic, and environmental knowledge to promote food sovereignty, social justice, economic sustainability, and healthy agricultural ecosystems. Ultimately, agroecology means bringing agriculture back into harmony with human ecology, including our biology, our environment, and our cultural and political structures. And I know this graphic is a little hard to see, but it gives an overview of the difference between the industrial system and an agroecological system. So in conclusion, farmers are rightly concerned about mining encroachment on agricultural land. There is no feasible way to extract natural resources from the land and have it simultaneously be farmed. New Brunswickers cannot eat shale gas or potash. So priority must always be given to land for food production. We're concerned about the impacts to farms during exploration and the long-term impacts on farmland and the environment should extraction proceed. This potential extraction will likely have little benefit to the farms and to the people of New Brunswick. As we try to mitigate climate change, it is necessary to look at repercussive impacts of all of our actions. The NFU strongly believes that all input use must be reduced. We must stop the more attitude and recognize that limits are critical guardrails that can prevent our civilization from crashing by devastating the biosphere upon which all people and economic activities depend. We must develop a sense of stewardship, the concept that we never really own the land. We use it carefully while we hold it in trust for those who must use it after us. Thank you.